Hi, I'm Amy Cornell, and I am your Texas broker for Front Real Estate. And we're here to talk today about the buyer rep agreement. This is something that new agents a lot of times get very nervous about, thinking that, man, these buyers are not going to want to sign a buyer rep agreement with me. I just need to just roll with it, just hope they sign the contract. I'll get paid on it. We'll be good. I'll tell you, that is really not a great platform to go on. There are reasons why the buyer rep is a really essential part, and I'm going to show you a couple of those. We're going to start with a PowerPoint so that I don't forget anything. But the first reason really why this is so important is because that makes them a client. By having them as a client and not as a customer, you are representing them and you're not a subagent for the seller. I know a lot of this was covered in your initial training with Trek, but it is a very important concept to know that you need to be under a buyer representation agreement from the very beginning. Otherwise, you do not have a duty of confidentiality to that buyer. But a lot of times they think that you do. And so you could go along, bebopping along, showing them houses. They're telling you all their life secrets and all these things, thinking that you are their agent. Well, really, you're a subagent for the seller. And so it's not fair for you to not have them sign this form, create the agency agreement, and clarify what your role is compared to what the listing agent's role is. This is a very important part. And I will tell you, in all of my years of doing real estate, I have not had buyers have an issue with this. And I will tell you that, and I maybe have two over the last 10 years that have had an issue with it. Most of them have, or I know of the two, one of them just went ahead and signed it. The other one chose not to. And I will tell you, I dodged a bullet, because if they are not willing to sign it, they are not a client that I want to work with. This is just a normal part of setting up that agreement. Just like if I walk into a bounce house place, right? I don't have an expectation that I'm just going to go and start bouncing without signing a disclosure for them saying, hey, if you fall and break your leg, that's on you, right? Every single time you're going to do that. That's part of this process too. It's a bigger form. I get it that it is a little more daunting, but it is very important to make sure that you have the agency set up right from the very beginning. So I wanted to show you a little bit of how to set that up. So prior to sending the buyer rep for signature, you do need to have some conversation about the buyer agent commission. I think that's where a lot of people get really hung up on this buyer rep agreement, is that it does have language in there that says, hey, if the seller will not pay the buyer agent commission, then the buyer will pay it. Well, let's get real. How many times is the seller paying for the buyer agent commission per MLS? Most of the time. Now, maybe it is not the previously agreed upon negotiated commission amount that was in the buyer agent commission, and at that was in the buyer representation agreement. And so at that point, there is some potential to renegotiate that or something like that down the road. But what you need to what I try to let my client know is that, hey, most of the time the seller is going to offer to pay it as part of their negotiated list price. If they are not going to pay it, or if they're not going to pay the full amount, I'm going to tell you that before we ever write an offer on that house, because I don't want to not get paid, and I don't want to put you in a position where you're having to pay this. If there's a good relationship with you and the client at that point, hopefully they see that, believe that from you, and they're willing to sign it without any issue. If there's not a great relationship, then maybe they are going to be afraid to sign it. And so that may be an indication too, that you've got some work to do on building trust and rapport with your client at that point. All right, so how do we actually get the buyer rep agreement signed? I'm going to pop over to Zip Forms and show you what Front provides for their agents, so that way you can know exactly how to get it signed from Zip Forms. I also wanted to show you that because we have the templates, really the only things that you need to change are these things: adding your information to the IBS, adding your buyer client information, adding the market area that y'all are covering, the dates of the transaction, and if you're going to charge a transaction fee to them. All right, so I'm going to pop over to Chrome and show you that when you go into Zip Forms, your username should be first name dot last name if you're with Front. If you're with another company, get with what your broker has you set up through Zip Forms. I'm going to hit and start a new transaction. I'm going to do a new purchase. I'm going to put in the street that I'm doing. So I'm going to do 539 Ridge Point in Argyle. And it's going to be a residential house. And then down here in the template section, one of the things that Fronts provides is these office templates. And so it's the front buyer rep package. So I'm going to click that, hit save. And then that's going to put together in this document section all the documents that I might need related to that buyer representation form. So I'm going to click on the information about brokerage services. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to put in my information here. Then I'm going to go into the buyer representation agreement. Like I said, I'm going to put in client information, market area, and term. Let's talk a little bit about market area. I'm going to normally do a market area for something like Greater Tarrant County. I do not want to have something like State of Texas there because I do not have competency or coverage even over the entire state of Texas. I think even over the North Texas region is probably a little bit too broad, but however you and the client determine, that is okay. The other thing too is if you have a client that is concerned about like, well, I'm using multiple agents. Maybe I have one agent helping me with rental properties in Forney, and I have another agent helping me acquire my main house in Fort Worth. That's okay to have multiple things. And so that's where you could define this here too. If they wanted to define this even as just one address that they're asking you to come help with, that's totally okay too. So they can put that in there. You can also have a limited term. You do not have to just have it be a 6-month term or something like that, even though that's what I see most often. I'll tell you, for me, I'm really looking at more of like a 120-day term, so that way then it has kind of a natural end that could be extended if we need to or not. But most of the time, if the client hasn't picked a home within 120 days, potentially I need to kind of move on to the next consumer so that I can help them since there's something stalled out in our process. It would not be appropriate to do a term of a year or more than a year on here. In my opinion, I really think 6 months, maybe 8 or 9 months would be the maximum time that we would want to put in here. All right. And then if you want to charge a transaction fee to your client or change the amount of commission that you're charging, you would add that into this broker's fee section. And so on this one, I have a blank here for the transaction fee. Really beyond that, there's nothing else that needs to be filled in. It is a very simple process to do the buyer rep. It can be done in about 3 minutes because you saw there was just not very much to fill in. So from here, I would send for signature this form all the way through to this form, wire fraud warning. Now you might say, oh my gosh, Amy, that is way too many forms. Like there is no way that buyer is going to sign all those forms. They are going to think I am so litigious that I am going to take them to the cleaners. They will not sign it. Well, that is in your head, not in their head, first off. I will tell you, for me, this is the exact same process that I fill out every single time. So if there is ever something that I'm going to be brought to court on related to a buyer rep agreement, I have a list of buyers that can say, yep, that's what I signed. Yep, that's what I signed. And I have it all backed up in my files. Okay, so there's no, sense of discrimination against one client. There's nothing. It is just, this is my business practice, is that I have every form signed every time. Now, who prepped these forms for us? These were prepared by the Texas Realtors attorneys. These are not TREC. These are Texas Realtors attorneys. These are attorneys for us that have said, hey, we think you need to have a buyer rep, and we're going to suggest all of these addendums. So why would I not have them signed? These are our attorneys saying, hey, best practice is have all these signed. I tell a story at this point about one of the reasons why I have it signed. So I've always done this, luckily, but about 8 years ago, I got a call from an angry dad of one of my clients that they were guys that I knew from church growing up. And when we turned on the news, his sons were standing on their rooftop because their home had flooded. It was a bad day. They had paid cash for the house not that long before closing, or not that long before it flooded. And I very much remember standing in that living room before they purchased it and saying, hey, this is in the flood zone. Because you're paying cash, you're not going to be required to get flood insurance, but I do encourage you to go ahead and get flood insurance. I remember that conversation, but when that dad was seeing his kids on the news, he didn't remember that conversation. And he started quickly turning the conversation to, what liability do you have? Well, I was able to quickly go in and pull up this information about special flood hazard areas and send it to him. And this is it is very general information about flood hazard areas. But in here it does say that, hey, You, buyer, are encouraged to inspect the property, review flood insurance policies, and contact any building permit authorities to make sure that you're comfortable with your status in your flood zone. So I sent that form to him and said, hey, look, I'm devastated about this. I'm really sad for you. But ultimately, there isn't liability on me because I had the conversation verbally, but I also have this form that was signed. It stopped the conversation. And it also salvaged our relationship so that I was able to represent them on their next purchase after they got paid out by the city, which ultimately happened. They got paid out by the city and they used that cash to go and buy another home. And I got to represent them on that too, because I was very professional, because I had everything done. It really changed the tenor of the conversation very quickly. And so just know, this is not a bad thing. These forms are not a bad thing. These are here to protect you, protect your client, and make sure that everything is done in the right, in the way that it's supposed to be. Okay, so if I'm going to have all of these signed, you can use this e-sign software. Digital ink is included with zip forms. It's very easy to use. I'm not going to show you here because I still use DocuSign. I know, the shame. Sorry. But I grew up in the business using DocuSign, and so I still pay extra to have DocuSign on here, even though they are very similar platforms. So whatever you're comfortable with is cool, but just know digital ink is free in zip forms, and so it's very easy to go and use instead of having to use DocuSign. All right, I'm going to pop back over to PowerPoint. The other thing to remember is that within 2 days of signing any documents, that they need to be put into SkySlope, and so that goes for this as well. So go ahead and get those documents into SkySlope so that way we can stay TREC compliant. All right, so we already talked about kind of timeline and area. Oh, and also the buyer rep is needed for any tenant representation and new construction too. Also, you'll need a buyer rep if you are personally buying a home. So because the company is representing you, the brokerage entity is representing you on that, then you would need that for yourself as well. And then if you're discounting, so, again, it just depends on what your agreement is with the buyer as far as what you're charging for your commission or adding in or discounting. However you're doing that, you are in complete control. But if you are doing that, you would need to make sure, if you were rebating the buyer, that you let the lender and title company know as soon as possible. Really, I would let the lender know before you ever contract, because you want to make sure that you're staying RESPA compliant and that they're able to add that into all the numbers for the buyer. If you're representing on both a buy and sell transaction, and maybe you're helping them sell something before they buy, and you wanted that buyer rep to have maybe a little more teeth in it, maybe that one would be something that would go out 9 months instead of a shorter time period, because you wouldn't want to get to a situation where you gave a price on the sale that you weren't comfortable with without both of those deals being done. So I would recommend going ahead and getting a listing agreement and a buyer rep signed at the same time in that situation, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. All right. And so that's all of those forms together, and then they're sent out and over to SkySlope. So I hope that this helps. I will tell you, buyer rep should not be scary. It is something that is very normal and is very necessary to make sure that you're getting that BAC, the buyer agent commission on MLS, instead of, and on Matrix and Netris anyway, it's shown as SUB. So down at the bottom of the MLS sheet, which actually I'll just go ahead and pop into MLS and show you real quick, so that way you can see what the difference looks like. Because in order to get that full BAC, you've got to have this buyer rep agreement signed. So let's see, I'm just going to pop into this new one. And so on this one, the subagent is getting 3%. The buyer's agent is getting 3%, so it would not have a difference. See on this one, the subagent is getting 0 and the buyer's agent is getting 3. So if you didn't have a buyer representation agreement on this one, then you would not have gotten paid at all. So this, sorry y'all, and I just realized that I didn't pop over to Chrome to show you that. Here it is. Sorry. Subagency is 0 and then the BAC is 3. And this is just at the bottom of your MLS sheet in Netris Matrix. So hopefully that helps. But just know, you really do, this buyer rep agreement is very important for the client, but also for you to make sure that you're doing good work and going to get paid on it. So let me know if you need anything. Otherwise, we will go from there. It's an exciting time to represent a buyer. It's not scary. I'll tell you, buyers are my favorite to represent because you really get the opportunity to really work with them to get them in the best possible situation going forward, versus when you're representing a seller, you kind of have to wait and see for what buyers are going to come to you. So I love it. I love it from a buyer perspective. I think it's just a really cool way to impact a family and to improve lives. We'll talk to you soon.